We Didn't Need Slaves by Dan Clarke. We didn't need slaves. We spouted off some things about needing to keep the other sentient species down so they couldn't threaten us. Maybe a few of the most gullible believed it. Slaves cost more in care and security than basic AI, but that was the point. They were a status symbol. As a society, and with the wealthier individuals, we could afford to waste resources on slaves. Anyone could get an AI assistant, but only the elite could use real creatures. When we found the humans, we already had 4 other species under our control. One of them we'd almost destroyed when they refused to surrender. We thought we knew what we were doing. How could a primitive race oppose us? After all, we were the masters. Our usual strategy worked wonders. Our fleet circled the planet, destroyed their satellites and space stations, then cratered half the moon with a near light-speed metal projectile. An hour later, we told them that they could surrender, pay a yearly tithe in slaves, and live under our strict restrictions, or die. They deliberated amongst themselves for one of their days and made a request. They would provide us the slaves, but they would not be killed or maimed out of hand, or be put to work in hard labor. If we agreed, they would give us useful people, intelligent and obedient ones, who could do clerical work and help in the home or office. In the past, 2 of our slave species had tried to give us their weak, unintelligent, and violent. We had to waste time dealing with the useless slaves, and then show this species the errors of their ways. If we could get useful slaves without force, we'd happily accept it. Also, there was little point in killing a slave needlessly. How could you show them off if they were dead? So we laughed amongst ourselves, and made it seem like we were doing them a great honor. They also asked if they could have their people become soldiers. We refused. We weren't stupid enough to give slaves weapons. 1 human year later, we received our first shipment of 15 million slaves. The humans hadn't lied. They had given us many smart and obedient slaves. We taught them our language and made sure they knew what would happen if they disobeyed. Then we sold them to businesses and families. The personal assistants were particularly favored once we learned how useful they could be. But really, all of them were sold for a top price. The butlers, nannies, and maids were already well trained. We barely needed to do anything beyond teaching them how to run the appliances and basic biology. The secretaries, janitors, drivers, and the rest all worked harder than our paid workers. It was like they were born to serve us. When the next tithe of 15 million arrived, there were fights as people rushed to buy them. We demanded 25 million the next year, and the humans meekly agreed. Within 10 years, anyone who was important had a human personal assistant. Businesses were teaching human technicians how to work with our AI. Every important family had human servants. A few businesses were letting humans help negotiate contracts after we learned about their lawyers. And soon after, we learned why they were so happy to help. We had watched them carefully for the first 5 years, but then we grew lazy. What was the point of having slaves if you spend all your time watching everything they did? As long as they did their job, everything would be fine, and any large mistake or problem would be found quickly enough. At least, that's what we thought. On the 15th anniversary of receiving our first human slaves, chaos struck. First, it was financial. Credits, resources, and entire companies were moved around seemingly at random. Entire planets were sold for a handful of credits, and a used ground transport was bought for billions. Companies sold themselves off to 1,000 different buyers who broke them up into even smaller pieces and sold them again. Everything was done with complete authority of the owners. And during all of this, many key members of the banks and financial worlds vanished. We faced an economic collapse. The government almost dealt with that. They were on the verge of shutting everything down, and damn the consequences when the power went out. All across our planets and space habitats, systems shut down, power was lost, AI refused orders, waste disposal stopped, and navigation systems failed. With panic and confusion already high, this pushed people over the edge. There were riots, suicide, assault, and murder. Many of our slaves joined in the chaos and began to attack us with a vengeance and hatred we hadn't thought possible. Despite all of this, we could have recovered. But then, the humans showed their hand. The nannies and caretakers took the children and the elderly and vanished with them. These were the families of the elites. They didn't care what happened to the lower classes. They wanted their children and parents back. And while this was happening, the assassins struck. Government officials, scientists, army officers, social elites, the business people, bankers, and financial experts who hadn't disappeared were slaughtered by explosion, by car crash, by poison, by knife, and by hand. Many humans had nothing to do with the killings. They were busy causing bloodless chaos, or in hiding. Still, out of the hundreds of millions of humans in our cities and homes, there were several million of them who were more than willing to get their hands dirty. We were headless. The leaders who were still alive were terrified of what happened to their children, and paranoid that they were going to be stabbed in the back. There was a rapidly expanding slave revolt. Our cities were on fire, with fighting in the streets. The humans had largely slipped away to pre-planned strongholds, with complete access to our AIs, which even we didn't have at that point. Our soldiers were being sent contradictory orders, sending them in circles, bombing rebel strongholds, only to find out they destroyed vital infrastructure or secure areas for officials, and wasting as many resources as possible. We thought it couldn't get worse. We were wrong. Humans took control of most of our habitats and several transport ships. Our communications cleared up long enough to hear their demands. We would surrender, or the space habitats would lose their air, and the transport ships would ram our planets at FTL speed. If we surrendered, we would be granted mercy. We surrendered. Our military abandoned their warships and weapons, which the humans quickly took over. After they had our weapons, they kept their word and showed us mercy. The viruses that had destroyed our AI were disabled. They stopped using the tools of our elites to tear our systems apart. They stopped killing our few remaining leaders. And then, they returned our children and elders who had been kept safely out of the way. Now, we are but a shadow of what we were. Planet-bound, with only a fraction of our former merchant ships, we are trying to repair the damage the humans did to our society during the days of chaos. But much of our resources are gone. They were sent to the slave species as compensation. We can only watch as the humans fly our ships between the stars, keeping the peace, keeping our former slaves from slaughtering us. We didn't need slaves. We took them anyways. Ultimately, it destroyed us.